Yeah. Good morning, everyone. We're so glad to have such a big crowd here today for EMDR and Parts by Dr. Arielle Schwartz. And my name is Gwen Wild. I'm a business development manager here at Pessy, and I'm going to be in the background keeping an eye on Q&A, and will pop on at question times to be able to ask Dr. Schwartz your questions out loud. So the Q&A box will come up in about 30 minutes, and at that time you can start popping your questions in there. It is a large crowd, so we may not be able to get to all of the questions. It would be super helpful if you would use the upvote feature by clicking on the little thumbs up, and that will help me to prioritize the questions to ask Dr. Schwartz at Q&A time. And AJ has posted some very helpful information in the chat box for how to get to your manual and more. If you have any issues at all, please start by going to the FAQ page in your portal to find out more. And let's see, I'll go over the schedule, and we are going to be talking about Central Time. So we're starting at 9:30 Central Time. Our morning break will be at around 11 Central Time, and then lunch from 12:30 to 1:10 Central, and then another afternoon break about halfway through, and we'll be dismissing at 4 o'clock Central Time today. So we'll be having Q&A right before each of those breaks. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arielle Schwartz. And so we're so pleased to have her here today. She's one of our very favorites here at Pessy. She's done a number of programs for us, and you can find other programs by her on our site. She's also the author of 6 amazing books. So you can check out all of her other programs and books on our website as well. And welcome today, Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Gwen. Hello, everybody. Thank you for all of the hearts and the thumbs up and the celebration emojis. Those are some of my favorite parts of doing these programs. When I can't see your faces, I can feel you. Ooh, all the hearts are coming now. So thank you. And I am so excited for today. I will just share with you that I myself am just coming out of being on a meditation retreat for the last 5 days, and I feel really deeply refreshed. And I'm hoping to convey a little bit of just deep connection within our time together, connection between us as much as possible across technology. I know you are all coming in literally from around the world. We currently have 2,200 people and still coming in from around the world. So what a joy. And also connection. Yeah, I know, big wows coming through on those emojis. I feel you. And I also just want to cultivate that sense of connection to self. I know that so many of us, whether you are a therapist, a coach, a parent, a person, a human in the world, navigating the complexities, whether that's post-hurricane, living in war zones, navigating the political complexities of various countries, including what's happening in the US with an upcoming election. There is so much that our nervous systems are navigating. And so let this be a self-care time for you as well. How can you come in and really be here for you? We have the next 6.5 or so hours to drop in, to be together, to feel. I will periodically remind us of that and invite opportunities just to notice, how are you breathing? What's coming up for you in relationship to this topic of complex PTSD? We are all human first, no matter what role we play in the world and what offerings we bring to the world. And so with that as a kind of starting invitation, just notice what's present for you in this moment. How is your nervous system today? Your body, your mind? How are your emotions helping you navigate the complexities of this world? How is your breath? Quick, slow, and without judgment, just allowing this brief check-in, this opportunity to notice your own body-mind system as a feedback network that then, as you notice what's present for you, you can do an even better job taking optimal care of yourself today. Now, personally, you'll see me with my hand right here over my heart often, or even just a real gentle rocking side to side. Those points of check-in, whether that's hands over heart, holding your face, a self-hug, they are welcome this whole time. Talking about complex PTSD, well, needless to say, it's a big topic. I'm going to speak about it largely in the context of developmental trauma, but that doesn't mean it's the only context, right? The complex PTSD, most simply defined, is the ongoing repeated events and the impact that those ongoing repeated exposure to trauma have on us, especially when we have no control to stop that ongoing barrage of the experience of threat. And when we feel, as a result of that, the kind of overwhelming quality of hopelessness or helplessness, that no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. And again, that can occur in childhood, and it can also occur in our current world where the systems around us, whatever those systems might be, that feel and that often are out of control, unhealthy, non-respecting, not dignifying of us as humans, that is accumulative, those impacts. It's what brought me into being a body mind practitioner. I really wanted to devote my work into understanding how we heal and how we heal from trauma as human beings, but very much so starting with myself and knowing that the things that brought me home and into balance within myself were those experiences that helped me embody and helped me tune into how did those events impact my felt sense of self, as well as um, practices that helped me learn how to breathe again, and yoga being one of those. I've been a yoga teacher for 30 years. I've been a somatic therapist for 30 years, and I've been an EMDR therapist since 2001. So kind of integrating these models for a long time. And my primary mentor that I have worked with, she wrote the preface to the post-traumatic growth guidebook. And her name is Betty Cannon, and I have worked with her for about 15 years in parts work therapies, primarily in Gestalt and kind of bringing together Gestalt and other parts work therapies in a very organic way that seamlessly integrates with the felt sense in the body, with the EMDR process, which of course is going to be such a core topic for us today of how do we blend these models. Even though somatic is not in the title of this EMDR and parts work for treating complex PTSD, it's in the secondary title, Somatic Techniques to Decrease Defensiveness. Everything that I teach is always going to include that mind-body work. You just cannot separate it. Our mind comes out of the brain in the body, right? It is all we're all one system. Pardon me. And so I think that I'll just name one other piece that's going to be part of this. It's all going to be within a relational model and in a bit of an applied existential model. Because at the core question, when we're working with complex PTSD, very often comes down to who am I, and am I allowed to exist? Do I exist? What is my existence? And especially when this begins in developmental trauma or when we're exposed throughout childhood to dehumanizing experiences, it strips away that core sense of self, or we just don't get to develop it in the first place. And so we're going to, in a sense, really affirm our existence throughout this whole process and that substantialness of self. And so much of how this work works is because we show up to bear witness to another person, compassionate witness, that presence that we're walking into the room or sharing with a group is the kind of foundation of everything that we're offering. And that when you're willing to show up and meet someone else and help them locate themselves, this is what it feels like to be seen, to be known, to be recognized, to be felt. And we're kind of laying down this foundation that sometimes was never built in the first place of what is it like to have a self. So with that said, we're going to weave in and out of the slides, the handouts. If you downloaded your manual more than a week ago, go back and there's a few slide changes that I made about a week ago. And so I'm pretty sure AJ, I haven't looked here, but I'm pretty sure AJ put into the chat, there it is again, the handouts link. And so if you're ever going, oh, wait a second, my handouts are different from what she's putting up on the screen, the most updated one is in that link. And like I said, it's really just a few changes just to clean some things up and update some things. So you will get a sense of my style here. I like to be able to kind of take up a little bit more of your screen than the slides do to feel some of that connectivity, especially in a webinar program. But the slides will guide us, and so they'll come up and then they'll periodically come on back down. So let me go ahead and share that slide deck here. Thank you again for all your hearts. They come through either way, so they're good to feel from you. This is our title slide. We're going to dive on in. The first few slides here are kind of some anchors and reminders for all of us. One of which is that I'm going to be sharing about specific modalities, parts work, IFS, structural dissociation model, Gestalt. I'm going to share about EMDR therapy. You may or may not have training specifically. I'll speak to EMDR. If you don't already have training in EMDR, you are still going to get so many nuggets that you can bring right into your practice because there are so many modifications of how we bring EMDR therapy in for complex PTSD that I have a feeling that a lot of you are going to go, oh, this is so usable, even if I don't have that EMDR training. But if you're wanting to do more of that EMDR, we've got a great program here for you with PESI. And so I'll just keep saying, like, you get to just keep staying involved. There are so many ways to keep building that toolbox. So know that that is out there for you. And that it's always going to be your responsibility to know that you're staying in your scope of practice. I'm personally a huge fan of ongoing supervision and consultation in our work. Guess what? I still have a supervisor because it keeps me clean. It keeps me thinking clearly about the people that I'm working with and how I'm showing up. So that's also kind of what helps us stay in our scope. In terms of my speaker disclosures, I do have books as when named. Several of them are published with PESI. I do receive royalties. That's really the only disclosure. And if you purchase those books, thank you. In terms of just another kind of core slide here, I want to speak a little bit about the accuracy of what I'm going to share with you today. When we look at psychology, it's always evolving Everything that we are learning is actually up for grabs. It's up to be challenged. It's meant to be challenged. And I'm going to speak some today about polyvagal theory. I'm constantly in conversation with the folks in the vagal regulation world about what is vagal regulation. And let's keep studying this and let's keep questioning it. And I'll share with you why I integrate polyvagal theory as differentiated from some of the other vagal regulation theories that are out there. But as you know, as I share with you my current understanding of the field, if you were to take this course again with me 3 years from now or 5 years from now, it will probably evolve and change again, and my slide deck will change again as a result. Because I hope that that's why we're here, and that your commitment, for example, to being in a continuing education program is also to enhance your ongoing knowledge, and that part of what we learn to do as psychotherapists is to be in a growth mindset, to know that we get to continue to evolve in how we work and how we think. So I'll also share with you that there are plenty of other ways of working out there. I'm going to share with you how I work, and you might have a background with CPT, cognitive processing therapy, or maybe you do trauma-focused CBT, maybe you do narrative exposure therapy. And some of what I'm sharing with you is different. See how they integrate, look for the similarities, look for the differences, be curious about it. I will also be very mindful when I'm speaking with you about what I think is potentially re-traumatizing for clients with complex traumatization. And also just speak about what are some of the therapies there that don't have out there that we're going to talk about today that don't have a ton of research. IFS doesn't have a ton of research yet. Internal family systems. Somatics is still growing. These are considered alternative and complementary approaches to psychotherapy because they're not evidence-based yet. That doesn't mean they're not effective or helpful. And remember that not every modality is right for every client, especially when we're working with our dissociative clients. The most important element is going to be your therapeutic relationship. We're going to talk about that again and again and again. And how do we know that our work is effective? We want to be able to talk about that with the people that we're serving. How is this working for you? Is what I'm doing feeling right? Is it feeling respectful? Do you feel like you have choice all along the way? Can you tell me what's not working? That is just as important as a client being able to tell you what is working. So, and again, I think I already mentioned this last bullet point around consultation and supervision and so forth. Our objectives for today, we've got a full day. We're going to talk about etiology and neurobiology of complex PTSD. We're going to look at diagnosis and assessment tools, especially in the context of a socio-culturally based case conceptualization. We'll define that. We're going to look at dissociation through the lens of polyvagal theory. We're going to look at a unified approach to parts work. This is not specifically an IFS or internal family systems approach. It's not specifically a structural dissociation approach, but I love both of those models. It's not specifically a Gestalt approach, but we're going to look at the integration of ego state work and all of those different approaches. And we're going to look at embodiment and somatic psychology and trauma treatment. And we're going to kind of explore those 8 phases. Again, this is not a replacement for an EMDR therapy training. That's its own 60-hour journey, but it's going to kind of give you a depth of understanding of how EMDR can be used for CPTSD. And then we'll close with the topic of resilience and a little bit on post-traumatic growth, which is one of my favorite topics all around. So we're going to start in. We've got so much to cover in one day. Wow. Here we go. Understanding CPTSD. I actually will share with you that the majority of the photos that are in this slide deck are my own. I am a nature photographer. I'm also a nature lover. I spend a whole lot of time out by the river and in the mountains and and so forth. And I chose this picture because it really captures something important. I was on a river trip. This was going down a section of the Colorado River, and this is the confluence where it meets the Green River. And there was a kind of section of this sandy beach, and off of the cliff of the sidewalls of the canyon, this rock had come down. Now, not any time recently, and certainly not when I was standing there. But what I really was struck in looking at this is the way in which it shaped the environment, right? Like it shaped the beach, the way that the winds blow, the way that the sand is reoriented around this that drops in. And it feels to me a bit like what happens with trauma, right? There is this event that comes down and it shapes us. Inevitably, it shapes us. And hopefully, we learn to adapt and accommodate and ultimately incorporate that experience into our overall sense of self. And when we are unable to wrap ourselves around it, to really deeply understand how did that impact me? How did that shape me? When we can't even realize what happened because it's too shocking or it's too overwhelming, then we spend a lot of time basically avoiding the thing, avoiding the big rock in the middle of the beach, right? And I think that part of our work is ultimately coming to terms with what is. We cannot change the past, but we can change our relationship to it. We cannot change what happened to us, but we can change how we perceive ourselves and what we believe is possible for our future. So let's define trauma. Let's just start right there. Trauma is any event that overwhelms the ordinary human adaptations to life. Once again, this photo was taken near the Maroon Bells near Aspen, Colorado. And this is, this dominates the landscape, even though there's this whole broad field of awareness. It sits front and center when trauma happens. And ultimately, what we want to be able to do in the face of a traumatic experience is to process it, to integrate it, to incorporate it into our overall sense of self. But I'm going to really lean in here. And what I love about Judith Herman, and of course, this quote comes from Judith Herman and her work, Trauma and Recovery, is Judith Herman is very much the kind of foundational understanding, brings us this foundational understanding of complex PTSD. Because when these events repeat and repeat and repeat and layer upon our sense of self, ultimately, not only do we not have places to go process it, do we not know how to really think about it and who we are as a result, but that these events, and I'll put plural here, start to leave us powerless or helpless with this loss of control, loss of dignity, loss of connection, a loss of a sense of belonging, and a loss of a sense of meaning. And so if we think that, in a sense, what our task is when we're working with this kind of overwhelming experience that dominates the landscape of self, is that we are here, whether it's for yourself, helping yourself heal, or whether you're helping others, we are here to reclaim that sense of control now. What do I have control of now? And it's tricky when the trauma is ongoing, because we could be speaking about, we might be working with someone, you yourself might be living in an environment where the trauma is still outside your door, or maybe it's still inside of the home where the person you're working with lives. And so what then is in our control inside of the world that we're actually in? Can we recognize, are we working with something that's over and done? or are we working with something that's ongoing? How do we hold that context for the people that we're serving? How do we recognize that even though there's so much that might be still out of your control, what is in your control? Where is there some empowerment? In what ways might we be able to identify and help someone reclaim and see someone with dignity? Offer that sense of connection. I love group work so much, right? I teach my therapeutic yoga still on Zoom, usually with about 100 people from around the world on the Saturdays that I teach. And there is group time built in there because groups are one of the best ways to build that sense of connection and belonging. And meaning making, we're going to talk about that today of how do I make sense of what happened to me, especially when those events are senseless? How do I create a meaningful life, even though XYZ happened or might still be happening? How do I create a meaningful, purposeful life? Meaning is not about saying that everything happens for a reason. I think that's very dismissive, right? It's how do I create a meaningful life? So let's look at trauma as a continuum. Acute trauma, right? This is the recent event. And the truth is, these are pretty common. And it's also normal to have abnormal feelings in response to an acute trauma event. Maybe it's loss of appetite, loss of sleep, feeling panicky, crying a lot, feeling sudden bursts of anger. All of these physical and psychological symptoms are expected after a traumatic event. And so even if we look at through the lens of the DSM, our diagnostic manual, the acute trauma has been moved out of the pathology section and just held within the factors affecting normal life, right? This is our adjustment to what does it mean to be human. The research suggests that at least 90% of humans will be exposed to one traumatic event in the course of our lifetimes. And that research was pre-pandemic. I keep going in to looking at my research databases to see like, has anyone done a post-COVID kind of general exposure to trauma research? And I haven't seen an updated one, but I can tell you that, when we broaden out what does exposure to trauma mean, and we look at these collective events that are around us, I'm going to say that if we're human and we're sensitive, we are all fielding and navigating the collective traumas that are happening in our world. And we want to build resilient systems. We want to really know how do we respond to those physical and psychological symptoms? How do we work with that so that we can have that an optimal or resilient response? And ideally, that requires that we have access to other people that help us process our world, that help us talk about it, that listen to us, that reflect, that attune, that help us feel our bodies, that help us re-regulate our nervous systems. When we don't have access to those kinds of support systems, we're more likely to sustain those post-traumatic symptoms, those post-traumatic stress experiences of vigilance, re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance symptoms. We're hyper aware sensorially to the world around us. We're more likely to have flashbacks or nightmares or felt sense in the body of the world is not safe or other people are not safe, or maybe I don't feel like I can trust myself. You'll notice that I have the word disorder in parentheses. We don't necessarily need to pathologize post-traumatic stress either. It's a normal response when we don't have the support after trauma exposure to process, to integrate that into our overall sense of self. And so we can hold that with a lot of compassion. And the time that we need to identify this as a disorder is if we need to use a diagnostic code for billing insurance, or if we, in some way or another, can go, oh, that's what's going on. Now I understand I have PTSD. I thought there was just something wrong with me, but there's actually a name for this, and I can understand myself better. So play around with our language and how we talk about these things, especially as ways to help people feel empowered in relationship to the language we use in psychology rather than in some way dismissed or othered. Right? We don't really want to other anyone in our use of language. I'm going to lean into a subtype now of post-traumatic stress, and this is the dissociative subtype. And I'm going to reference here Ruth Lanius. She is one of the primary researchers on this dissociative subtype. And what her work has helped illuminate is that we so often identify post-traumatic stress in these hyper-arousal symptoms, high arousal symptoms, that hyper-vigilance, that re-experiencing, the urge to avoid thinking about being exposed to anything that's a reminder of the trauma. But sometimes trauma shows up in more of a hypoarousal state. And this is especially the case when the trauma is ongoing and we cannot stay present to the reality. It would be too much, too overwhelming. And as a result, we begin to shut down the sensory processing of the world around us. And we go into more symptoms of derealization. The world around me doesn't feel real. A classic example, and an individual that I've worked with for a long time described it is all of a sudden the world around him became like a film set, and that like the buildings were just facades. There was nothing behind it. People became like cartoon figures. They were not real. His own self became unreal to him. This experience of this derealization or non-realization, unrealization, because to be with reality as it is cannot be accommodated by the individual. It's too much. Depersonalization. I will not make myself real to me. And how do we do that? We disconnect from our emotions and we disconnect from our sensations. And then with this kind of looking at this hyperarousal, this hypoarousal, let's talk about complex PTSD, which is, of course, our topic for today. And here we see very disorganized autonomic states going between the hyper and the hypoaroused states, dysregulated emotions, difficulties with self-concept, and more challenges with interpersonal relationships. We're going to kind of speak about all of these symptoms with greater depth. So we're going to come back to this. Before I go into the next slide, I'm going to take down my slide deck for a moment and just speak a little bit more about what does it mean to process an acute trauma when something happens and it's kind of shocking for us in the immediacy of that. So I'm going to take this down. And I'm going to go back in time and just share a little bit of my own background. So I started studying somatic psychology formally in 1996. And so I had about 3 years of my master's degree program in somatic psychology, which was integrative of some somatic experiencing and sensory motor psychotherapy and Hakomi. And we'll talk some more about what is somatics as we go along. But I had learned enough in those 3 years to really know that when we experience something really shocking, really overwhelming, that the shakiness that we're experiencing is our body's best attempt to move that cortisol through, to release something, to kind of come back to homeostasis. And so I was driving my car and I got in a car accident. It was sudden. The other person had run a light. Their car spun around. My airbags went off. It was shocking. And I got out of the car and my entire body was filled with adrenaline, right? If any of you have ever experienced these kind of shocking moments, you know what that feels like. And with this kind of equipped knowledge of 3 years of studying somatics, I was standing outside of my car and just letting my body do what it needed to do. And so as I'm standing there next to the other driver and we're kind of waiting for the accident report, and I'm just standing there going, whoa, woo, oh, wow, that was a lot. Wow, whoa, right? Voice, arms, shaking the legs, moving my body, bouncing, shifting my weight side to side, right? I can even feel right now my heart is accelerated, just moving a little bit. You want to move with me? You're moving something through? Always feel free. Take care of you through this program. But, so I'm doing this. Here's the other driver, right? And so the next thing I know, I'm coaching the other driver. It's okay. We need to move this through. That was a lot, right? And so we're basically having this conversation. Now, mind you, I live in Boulder, Colorado. And we, are doing our accident report and the police come and I'm just continuing to kind of shake some of this off and move this energy. And I was sharing this story actually at a PESI training. This was pre-pandemic in New York City, maybe going back to about 2018 or so. And I was sharing a version of this story in New York. And gratefully, one of the attendees, a beautiful Black woman from New York, came up to me and she said, Arielle, as a Black person in New York, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that while I'm speaking to the police. And it was such an important moment, right? Think about this. Think about context. How we move our bodies, how comfortable we are moving our bodies in different contexts. And, imagine a Black man speaking to the police, feeling free to move his body, and what messages and what internalizations we get about whether or not it's safe even to shake something off. So we're going to continue to hold the entire, yeah, thank you for all of your emojis here, right? It's so important just to continue to hold all of our interventions in context. And when do we feel safe to move and use our voice and to let something go? And how much conditioning so many of us in a variety of contexts have received to button it up or to keep it contained, because if I express myself, I could make the situation worse. And whether that's a cultural context is the one that I was just giving, or a developmental trauma context where there are shocking events that are happening, and I actually can't show you how it made me feel because it would make me a bigger target. So all of the ways in which we clamp down on what actually wants to move through us, needs to move through us in order for us to have a healthy, I'll call it psychobiology. Right? And that word psychobiology is a word that comes from a man named Alan Shore, who is in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And Alan Shore kind of speaks about the healthy psychobiology of a child who is growing up in a family where they're being attuned to, and we can even go all the way to infancy, where we're being attuned to, and that the healthy psychobiology is basically this ability to move between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic state. And that we're actually, as we're attuning to an infant, and in this case, the parent, the caregiver, is what we call a psychobiological regulator for that infant. And ideally, that attuned caregiver recognizes when there's a need for rest, a need for the infant to go inward, to be swaddled, to be held, to not be overstimulated by the world around them. And there's other times in which the infant is in a play mode and needs, and needs to move and is cooing and wants interaction. And we can start to see right there patterning around sympathetic play and parasympathetic rest. And let's say something frightening happens, just a loud sound, and the infant startles. Sympathetic can be followed by soothing and rocking, and oh, that scared you, right? And we come back into parasympathetic regulation. So we're going to watch this rhythm of moving between sympathetic and parasympathetic as this healthy psychobiology of the child. And when we have those rhythms of moving between sympathetic and parasympathetic, let's go back to my car accident story. Sympathetic, shock, right? The airbag and everything that happened with that. And coming back to parasympathetic is rocking my own body, releasing my voice, shaking something out, reorienting attention back into safety, and being able to ride those waves from the intensity back down into the regulation zone. When a child is growing up in an environment when there are ongoing shocks or ongoing dismissive experiences, ongoing abuse, ongoing neglect, we lose those healthy rhythms. Either a child is remaining in high arousal states for extended periods of time, high vigilance, tracking their environment, or they're remaining in low, more parasympathetic states, but there's not enough stimulus. In the case of neglect, there's not enough touch, there's not enough contact, there's not enough witnessing, and there isn't the support to actually be a mobilized self out in the world. And so we want to actually cultivate this both and. When we have that, and when we feel safe to be ourselves just as we are, we're building what we'll call an integrity to this body-mind relationship. Who I am is, what I'm feeling on the inside is what I can show on the outside. There's a congruence between what I feel and hear, what I show, what is seen, and what is reflected back to me. That's an integrity of a body-mind relationship. And as we continue to grow, we start to develop language on top of that felt sense. Oh, this feeling in my body, that's sadness. And someone helped me name that and they reflected that. And now I know what sadness feels like. This feeling, this is anger, right? Now I have a word for that. Someone took your toy away. Of course you're angry about that, right? And that you start to identify these feelings have these words. And that gives what we'll call this coherency of self, that I can articulate with words what I'm feeling. So now I can ask for what I need. I can differentiate between hunger, sadness, anger, and fear. They have different sensory experiences. And because I can know what I feel in the inside, I can ask for that. I can advocate for that in relationship. And we'll take that coherent sense of self, that language ability with us into adulthood, so that when we move into relationships with others, I can articulate who I am on the inside to help someone else better understand me. And therefore, I can advocate for that relationally and help someone else go, yeah, I am angry, but I'm not angry at you. Or, I can say that to someone else and they can go, oh, okay, well, that's helpful to know. I sensed that there was anger, but I didn't know what it was about, right? So we can have those conversations and they will enhance this development of healthy and reciprocal relationships. What happens with complex PTSD in developmental trauma is the loss of all of those capacities. So our next slide is essentially illuminating that picture. So with CPTSD and developmental trauma, these adverse interpersonal childhood traumas lead to a breakdown in that psychobiology of the child. I'm either stuck in sympathetic or I'm stuck in parasympathetic, but I've lost that flexible ability to move between the two. I've lost that integrity in the body-mind relationship. Maybe I cannot show you what I'm feeling on the inside because it could backfire. It could lead me to be in greater danger. Or there's no one there to see it. Maybe I've lost that formation of a coherent identity because nobody helped me develop the language for what I was feeling inside. If you've ever worked with someone with alexithymia, is a term that basically means that I don't have language to identify the feelings that I'm having inside. So the feelings are lost to me. I don't know that when I have these sensations, they are associated with sadness or with anger or with fear because nobody helped me bridge the language capacity with the bodily felt sense and the emotions, the emotional experience. So I don't have that coherent sense of self. And if I can't communicate to myself how I feel, I can't communicate that to somebody else. And so it impairs the development of those healthy and reciprocal relationships. When we look at the development of CPTSD in adult traumas, let's say refugee, domestic violence, the captivity, ongoing harassment or discrimination, not feeling safe or protected in your world, adults with complex PTSD may not have these early developmental deficits, but they have had equally damaging experiences of relationships with others that have catastrophically changed their view of themselves, other people, and the wider world. These individuals, and I'll say I'm using two quotes here, and you can see the references. These individuals can experience mental defeat, a state of giving up in one's own mind all efforts to retain one's identity as a human being with a will of one's own. Whew, I just take a few breaths with both of these slides, identifying that complex traumatization within the context of developmental trauma and the ongoing experiences that can happen in adulthood, and how this impacts one's sense of self and embodiment. It's a lot. And sometimes it's both, right? Sometimes there are the relational developmental deficits and these ongoing world situations. The result, what Marty Seligman termed learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is, I think, often at the heart of complex PTSD. And this is in no way to blame an individual for the experience of what we're going to refer to as learned helplessness here. This isn't blaming the victim, it's understanding. And it's a core loss of self-efficacy. The individual carries the learned experience and accompanying belief that their actions do not make a difference in the outcome of their lives. It's so significant. And especially when this begins in childhood, because that was probably very true back then. No matter what they did, they couldn't get the parent to stop drinking or the domestic violence to stop or the parent to stop abusing them, or they couldn't get someone to come and see them or pick them up or understand them or listen to them. No matter what they did, it wasn't going to make a difference. The biggest challenge is that that loss of self-efficacy comes into adulthood, and there is still the core sense of self that says, what's the point of trying? It's not going to make a difference. I've tried that before. It didn't help. And we have to reorient that in many ways that individual is looking through the eyes of the child self, where indeed that was true then. And we can have so much compassion for the fact that no matter what they did then, it wasn't going to make a difference. And coming back, I'll take down my slide, coming back to when this is being repeated in world events now, it gets really tricky because there is to some degree the truth that we cannot stop the war from happening, or the climate change and the hurricane and the tornado and the earthquake and, fill in the blank. But What we can do as adults is twofold. One is that we can start to orient towards that child where it was life and death back then. And we can hold them close, and we can start to build self-compassion for that experience of learned helplessness, for that experience of the helplessness and the hopelessness that was so true back then. And we can also start to identify, even though there are still these elements of my life, my world that are out of my control now, what is in my domain? What can I and do I have control over now? Is it reaching out for that one other person who's willing to care and listen? Is it showing up for that free online class, the yoga class, right? Is it finding those resources on the internet, because there's so much resource. We have a complete buffet of resource out in the world. But if we are carrying that loss of self-efficacy, doesn't matter. We can walk into the buffet. We don't have a plate to put anything on. We don't even sense that we can pick up anything and put it on our plate. And so we're trying to differentiate now from then enough to say, even though there's all of this that's out of my control, what is in my control and what will help me feel better in this hour, in this day, this week. And all of those small actions that move us toward just a little bit more resilience. It's like that needle, just a little bit more resilience, just a little bit more. They accumulate. And our overall sense of self begins to grow with just a little bit more empowerment and a little bit more, right? And that over time, we can sense what is in our domain, right? I often think of that serenity prayer, right? Like, grant me the ability to differentiate between that what I don't have control over and what I do have control over, right? So that I can sense and, let's say, make a difference. I can take action in the arenas where I can create positive change. All right, back into our slides for a bit. So I'm going to break down all of these different categories of symptoms of CPTSD one by one in the next few slides. But here's a listing of the core symptoms. And what I will also name here is that if you are working diagnostically, the complex PTSD has already been added into the ICD-11. This is the World Health Organization's international coding of diagnoses. It has not been added into the DSM, and we are still using the ICD-10 as, at least in the United States, as our diagnostic coding system. We have not updated into the ICD-11. It got delayed with the pandemic. We were supposed to shift in January of 2022 to using the ICD-11, and that has not yet happened. And I, again, kind of keep doing my searches of when are we making that shift, because we still don't have an official diagnostic code to use for CPTSD. The closest is to use a diagnostic coding for PTSD, chronic, and that, for me, a diagnosis is only valuable when we have a narrative that accompanies it. So you can put into your clinical notes that narrative, that case conceptualization of this was chronic ongoing neglect, or this was chronic ongoing abuse, this is chronic ongoing exposure to domestic violence, fill in the blank. And so that we can kind of hold the symptoms in context. The other thing to know diagnostically is that CPTSD basically builds on the diagnosis of PTSD. So we look at the core diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, we're looking at an event, and then these re-experiencing heightened arousal and avoidance symptoms, the first three in this list. What's tricky about CPTSD is sometimes it's harder to find, quote unquote, the event, because we're talking with our clients and they're like, the event was my whole life. The event was that nobody ever gave me a feeling of being valued. Nobody ever took the time to listen to me and to understand me. I didn't feel that I belonged in my family system, or I didn't feel like I belonged in the world. So we have to advocate that the omission of something can be an event, or that the ongoing experience is quote unquote the event. And then we have in CPTSD these three additional categories of symptoms: difficulties with affect regulation, disturbance with self-organization, dissociation and loss of identity, and interpersonal problems. So let's go into each of these. Re-experiencing. Here we're looking at flashbacks, nightmares, being easily triggered. Those are very often what we think of with re-experiencing, thinking about trauma events at inconvenient times. But when we're looking at events that happened in pre-verbal memories, early childhood, dissociative experiences, very often these intrusive symptoms come in the form of somatization or pain and illness symptoms. And clients don't know why they're feeling what they're feeling, but we can start to be curious about the chronic migraines or the other chronic symptoms that are showing up. And it doesn't dismiss that there might also be medical cause, but let's actually be curious about how the body is expressing the ongoing exposure to pain. Looking at avoidance symptoms, yes, there's withdrawal and isolating, avoiding places or people that might be reminders of the trauma. We might also see the use of alcohol, substances, food, work, or caretaking to avoid being with one's own feelings. And that there may also be qualities of perfectionism or highly intellectual or highly self-critical as ways to not feel, not tap into the bodily felt experience. We might also see these heightened arousal symptoms, that hypervigilance, being on guard, startling easily, being highly sensitized to cues of threat in people's body language, facial expressions, and voice tone. I often think that when clients are coming in and they're saying, I'm a highly sensitive person or I'm highly empathic, and I start to hear about the early childhood wounds, I really think that that high sensitivity is a conditioned response to needing to be vigilant to the world around you. Can I sense in the body language, facial expressions, voice tone, emotional experience of another person, whether or not they're going to hurt me right now, whether or not they've been drinking? Can I hear the footsteps coming down the hallway and know what mood they're in? So it's almost like this expansion of that sensory sensitivity in attempt to predict the world around me. Maybe that heightened arousal is needing an escape plan. It's that flight response. Maybe it's expecting the worst to happen and always being prepared to self-protect, being in a chronic fight response. I think Pete Walker's book on complex PTSD is really beneficial for understanding some of these chronic trauma symptoms that become almost personality traits, right? Maybe it's being so heightened to other people's needs that I'll take care of you in hopes that you won't hurt me, what Pete Walker also refers to as a fawn response. And so we can look at some of these chronic trauma states and see how they become personality and help our clients recognize, I just thought that was me. Wait a second. I didn't know that that chronic caretaking and ignoring my own needs was a symptom of my trauma. Wow. Emotional dysregulation, crying uncontrollably, even after what we might call a minor, not to dismiss it, but a minor everyday challenge, being late for a meeting, caught in traffic, dropping your food on the floor, spilling the milk, right? And it feels like it could just take someone down, right? Taking a long time to recover after stressful events, right? That those smaller things happen, but they impact the whole rest of the day or sometimes multiple days. Frequently feeling angry, irritable, anxious, or panicky, feeling hopeless, depressed, numb, and having difficulty feeling joy or pleasure. and self-harming urges or suicidal ideation. And of course, several of you, what are we at now? 3,200 people here together. Some of you are kind of having this question right now of how do we differentiate between borderline personality presentation and the emotional dysregulation that comes with CPTSD? And to some degree, we can look at these as kind of coexisting phenomena. It doesn't mean that borderline personality isn't also its own phenomena, but that they often are rooted, the borderline presentation often is rooted in CPTSD. And sometimes it's a matter of that mismatch between a highly sensitive child in an environment where parents do not understand that inner world of that child. And so there's chronic misattunement, chronic misunderstandings that build into the overall sense of self. But that challenge with the emotional dysregulation being one of those very strong characteristic elements to the borderline presentation. And I don't use borderline in any way to, again, other another person. We're talking about it as an understanding, as a phenomenon, that borderline in its essence is actually sitting on the borderline between neurosis and psychosis. It's a very interesting term. And I'll take this down for a second. We'll come back into our symptoms. But it actually sits at that intersection where the world around me was so overwhelming for so long that I had to make it unreal. I had to disconnect from the reality of it. And as a result, I can't accommodate that what was happening to me wasn't okay. So I make me not okay. And then there's this self-attack. And because the shame that sits underneath that not okayness is so intolerable, I will attack you. And it becomes this push-pull of I have no organized strategy to know how to get my relational needs met. And this disorganized state, we can look at it as a disorganized attachment, again, as a foundational element to that borderline presentation, is so deeply confusing. It is so deeply confusing. Who am I? What is mine? What is yours? And I can't tolerate this confusing, disorganized state. And there's this kind of flailing experience as response. I can't I can't even imagine what safety in my body, safety in relationship, or safety in the world could feel like. And the only possible, again, flight response is get me out of this. Get me out of this life. Take away this numbness or this pain, whatever it is. So again, the suicidal ideation and the self-harming become go-to responses. And the push and pull and the pushing the other away as soon as they get close, as soon as your own need for attachment arises, that in itself is intolerable. Because when I felt that in the past, and nobody came, it was life and death. Oh. So we can feel into and compassionately hold these dilemmas with another person without making them wrong for carrying them. And if we can sit there and not take personally the fact that they're pushing us away and not letting the care that you show up to give your client, and they are deflecting it and they're pushing it away and they're making you wrong, right? And if we cannot take that personally, we can see that as the symptom. And again, if we're holding all of our work relationally, these reenactments in the therapeutic relationship, when the core wound was relational, as Philip Bromberg says, these reenactments are inevitable. And get this, they're a sign of good therapy. The reenactments that are happening relationally are actually a sign of good therapy because we're getting into the root relational cause of the wound. And it's showing up in the room. And the biggest thing that we're going to look at in those relational moments is how do we take the ruptures that are happening therapeutically, because they inevitably will, and how do we find ways to cultivate repair moments? And this rupture into repair was the missing element in childhood. Right. And again, I'm going to mostly talk in that developmental context in this case. So if we're looking at the fact that there was rupture and rupture and rupture and rupture and little to no repair, the sense that anyone else will actually ever take accountability for the impact of their actions on me feels like a unicorn. Like that's not even possible. And if we as therapists can go, ooh, I think I missed that. It looks like I hurt your feelings when, right? And if we can sit and be curious and non-defensive in those moments, we have this opportunity to allow our clients to experience the empowerment that comes with saying, I didn't like it when you did that, Arielle. And they're like, oh my gosh, thank you for telling me. That is so important that you let me know that. Let me explore and really take responsibility for the impact of whether it was a facial expression or something that I said and how I said it, even if I didn't mean it that way. Nonetheless, the impact was there. And sometimes what we're repairing is a wound that we never created in the first place, right? What we're sitting with as a projective process is the transference, if we use the therapeutic language. And if we can hold that transference so tenderly and say, oh, man, they must have felt so chronically dismissed and so misunderstood and so discounted. And if we can go, oh my gosh, you felt really discounted when I said that. That was the last thing that I meant. And thank you for telling me. And I'm so sorry. And to know that we're a stand in that apology for what happened, right? Even those words, I was just in conversation this weekend with someone who said, sometimes the apology isn't what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for someone to say, you're right, I did that. It's powerful. You're right. I did say that. Thank you. And that we're modeling our own willingness to grow and to be impacted by the client. They have importance. They are changing you. How powerful is that? The therapeutic relationship isn't a one-way change street, right? This is a bi-directional relationship. And when our clients are sensing that they too are impacting us, that we're growing too, they actually feel empowered. Like I have an importance that I bring to the world. My goodness, I could actually, like move you, right? When we tear up, when we're sitting with another, and this question comes up so often in consultation and supervision, like, oh my gosh, so, like this moment happened and I was moved to tears by what my client said. Like, is it okay to show that? And obviously, we don't want the client to take care of us or feel like they're responsible for us. But there's a way in which we're showing them that they have importance, that they have moved us, that they're real, right? Because they've landed in another person. That's so profound. All right, I'm going to go back into our slides. So coming back to our layering of the different symptoms, the disturbance with self-organization can show up in a few different ways. Cognitive distortions, this internalization, there's something wrong with me. It's all my fault. I don't deserve to exist. I can't trust anyone. I'm damaged. And these cognitive distortions often become very globalized and very fixed, right? This is something that is universally true about me or the world or others, and it's not changeable. And so we're going to really work to create more cognitive flexibility, or exploration, observing these core beliefs rather than being adherent to them, being willing to question them. We'll also be up against that mental defeat. No matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. So what's the point of trying? It's this core sense of futility and that loss of sense of identity. I don't even know who I am. No one ever helped me discover who I am. We get to do that with someone. What a privilege. What a profound privilege to help someone discover who they are. Maybe we're up against that loss of hope for the future, or deep feelings of shame, guilt, and unworthiness, over responsibility. Maybe it's that having a hard time finding that sense of self, purpose, or meaning to life. We'll talk, of course, throughout the program about how we counter this, how we build this over time. And then we also see the interpersonal challenges, the difficulties in spending time with other people, avoiding spending time with other people, having a hard time trusting folks, relying too heavily on other people, or feeling terrified of being abandoned, choosing, we'll say, the wrong people, reenacting hurtful or dangerous relational dynamics with others. And so, I remember working with an individual who not only had experienced her own childhood trauma in which she had a narcissistic mother, a father who was abusive to her. There was no protection. And then, her first relationship was, a repeat of this because she had to dim down the sensory experience. She had to exist in that family. She had to attach to them. And so when she was 19 and entered into a relationship with someone who ended up being an abuser for the next 7 years of her life, it was familiar. And it also was like part of her coping mechanism is that she stopped trusting her own bodily felt sense. One of my clients, a different client, once said this to me. She said, "Yeah, I just learned how to paint all the red flags white." And I stopped paying attention to the signs that let them know that they weren't safe for me. And so I ended up back in those relationships again and again. Maybe the interpersonal challenges are that reactivity, defensiveness, blaming, unwilling to hear other people's perspectives. And then our next category of symptoms, and we'll talk more about this later, is that dissociative fragmentation. Staring into space for long periods of time, difficulty remembering broad, periods of your life, suddenly getting tired, feeling far away, looking at the world through a fog, expressing that people, objects, or the world feels unreal, feeling disconnected from your body, emotional numbness, feeling like you're different people in different situations, blending with younger parts, feeling, acting, or speaking like a younger person, arriving in places and not knowing how you got there, or finding items in your house but not remember buying them. And we'll speak a whole lot more about dissociation as we go. Additional symptoms of complex PTSD: self-harm, suicidal thinking, plans or attempts, addictions, emotional eating, eating disorders, social anxiety, difficulty concentrating, impulsivity, excessive risk-taking. So it makes differential diagnosis tricky, doesn't it? Because we can start to look at this and be like, okay, so it might be CPTSD, but it might also be substance abuse. It might be an eating disorder. It might be that there's social anxiety or panic disorder, and there we're looking at at major depressive disorder. And how do we differentiate what's trauma etiology and what is a different organic diagnosis? What I often say is that if you're addressing the trauma, you're going to help with the perspective of the nervous system and the parts and and when you think about parts work therapy, especially IFS, it was built around Richard Schwartz was working with eating disorders. But we're also dealing with trauma. So I'm not so often that worried about what is the diagnosis, because the work is going to work regardless. And that's what's beautiful about what I'll call kind of a transdiagnostic model. And then excessive risk taking being at the bottom of that list. And before we go into our Q&A, which Gwen will help me with in about, I'm going to say, Gwen, give me about 5 more minutes and we'll move over to some questions. I know there's a lot of questions out there. But I just want to kind of cover just a little bit more here, and then we'll open it up. So when we're looking also at CPTSD, it also often shows up in our health, right? It shows up in the development of chronic illness and pain conditions, whether that's seizures or even psychogenic seizures, migraines, gastrointestinal problems, autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, medically unexplained symptoms, and that our goal is to, again, kind of work with the underlying emotional loading that can contribute to the worsening of those symptoms. It doesn't mean that there might not also be a medical cause or medical diagnosis. But what we do know about somatization is that the unprocessed emotions and the unprocessed traumas tend to worsen these physical expressions of trauma. And then we also have what I'll refer to here as kind of the hidden factors. The hidden factors are the pre-verbal traumas, the pre-perinatal, the traumas that began even in utero. And the client doesn't have any narrative, any story, but there's a whole lot of bodily felt sense. And along those same lines, we have epigenetic loading and generational trauma, in which the unresolved trauma in the parents or primary caregivers is actually loading into the developmental experience, the attachment experience between the caregiver and the child. We might also have an individual growing up in a family where there is this kind of poor modeling of health promoting behaviors. So they're inside of an environment where there's smoking, drinking, drug use, lack of nutrition, lack of exercise, and that's contributing to this overarching sense of self. I put in here the presence of a learning disability because so often children with learning disabilities are harder to parent. Parents get really frustrated with children that, let's say, aren't learning to read on time or are struggling in school. And it can then become this vicious cycle where the parents reacting more strongly. Maybe that child has impulsivity challenges. Maybe they have more emotion dysregulation, and becomes this vicious cycle. Now, let's also look at the presence of a learning disability as the outcome of developmental trauma. So sometimes what happens is that the child is growing up in a chronically unsafe environment. They're in survival brain. They're in chronic states of fight and flight. They're tracking vigilantly their environment. Their learning brain is not able to take in new information, learn, process a math equation, for example. So we can just be curious when we're looking at someone who's coming in telling us about dyslexia or math challenges or difficulty with concentration or impulsivity as a child. Let's be curious about that, and that kind of bi-directional relationship. Again, we're going to keep in mind as we're developing what we'll call our case conceptualization, the social and cultural risk factors, ongoing oppression, discrimination, bullying, harassment, lack of belonging, lack of protection by your country, by your political systems, and so forth. And then the lack of resilience factors, and we'll talk more about what those resilience factors are, but not having even one single adult in your life who took the time to know the inner world of you as a child, who was curious and who leaned in to get to know you. All right, Gwen, let's go ahead and pause here and do some Q&A. I know there's like 84 questions out there, so
Yes.
I'll let you
Okay, so
summarize.
many questions, so much great information. First, we have a few, and I did hear you mention borderline personality disorder, but Florence and Grace and Jessica have all received a lot of upvotes. So, a lot of interest in distinguishing borderline personality disorder from complex trauma, and if it makes a difference in intervention, especially in addressing abandonment.
Uh-huh. Oh, I love that question. I really, really do. It's almost like I can feel it. I know you've put several questions in one, but I can feel that in there. First of all, in terms of the how we treat, and I want to kind of tag on the abandonment piece as a little separate, but like in terms of how we treat borderline and CPTSD, I would say that the first line of all trauma treatment is what we call stabilization, right? In Judith Herman's phasic model of trauma recovery, we always want to get enough stabilization so that we're not going to go in and work with the the kind of rawest traumatic events until we know that someone basically has some basic skills of emotion regulation, of self-compassion, of making sure that, again, there's enough safety in your current environment so that we're not opening up that deep wound of attachment, abandonment, for example. Now, usually it's not so much that our work is opening up that wound. They're coming in with that wound raw, right? Like, so if we look at the first part of the question of do we need to really know whether it's borderline, CPTSD, or both in order to do this work? Not necessarily, because if we're going to come in with some stabilization, stabilization is going to be achieved through a relationship that feels like it can help me hold myself in those raw places, that there is some sense of what safe even could potentially feel like. And safe is a tricky word, right? It's a sometimes we can replace that word with just orienting to the cues that help you feel that you're in the here and now versus the there and then. So we're going to talk a little bit more, especially when we get into parts work later today, about helping people differentiate from being so blended with young self states, which I think is really often at the root of that abandonment anxiety. If we think about what comes up with borderline rage states, it's abandonment rage, right? It's the experience of I'm here and now today, right? I've texted my boyfriend and they didn't text me back in time, and now I've sent them 100 texts, right? It's those states that our people drop into that feels so out of control. It's so raw. Who's flailing in that moment? It's the infant self. Oh, right. And so, can we together learn to identify and use this language of, oh boy, that just touched off that really early young wound of feeling so raw, like nobody was coming to pick you up, or if they did, you didn't know when it was going to come, and you didn't know what was coming your way. And it's such a raw place. It's such a young place. Can we help? And I'm going to borrow from Janina Fisher, whose work I love, 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 right? And of course, she's here with Pessy too. And one of the things that she often says is that when you are blended with a part, you are simultaneously abandoning that part. So what we're cultivating, and this is where the parts work comes in really well. And I will say that again, because I could feel someone out there like, what'd she just say? When you are blended with the part, you are simultaneously abandoning that part. So let's say the client slides in and becomes that baby self and is sending the 100 texts and is feeling the urge to self-harm and is feeling the intolerable state. We need to help them identify that they've become the baby self. And just a little bit of that, I'll say that phrase to my clients on a pretty regular basis. When you're blended with that baby self, you're simultaneously abandoning it because that baby self needs you to be the adult now. And it's so hard to do that because, we all have had that client, or at least many of us have had that client that says, but I always had to be the adult for me. I am so sick and tired of having to be the one that takes care of me. I had to raise myself, right? And so often what I'll say is what's different now is I'm helping you hold you. You are able to come here and share finally what it was like to feel that raw and that alone and that abandoned. And I'm going to help you learn how to be here now in your here now adult self so that you can be the one, as Richard Schwartz says, be the one you've been waiting for. Be the one that can actually hold that part of you now. And the only way to do that is to become your here now adult. And this is where the existential piece comes in, y'all, because it feels like there is this really deep layer of, but this is the only self I know. And in order to let go of being so identified with that young self feels like a death, and to some degree it is. And it feels like grief, and 1,000% it is, because what I'm grieving is the baby self carrying the hope that that good adult is finally going to show up. And that, excuse my language, folks, is fucking painful. It's so raw. And we can help our people ultimately be with that rawness and to just go, oh, right, just like you can touch just 2% of that, because what sits inside of that grief is longing. It is that cry for help, baby self. But if we're not blended with it, we can basically pendulate toward and away. We can go toward that deep longing and that deep pain. And we can also know that I'm here now. And here are the cues that let me know that it's safe enough now to feel it. Here are the cues that let me know that there's enough connection now that I can go towards that part that had no connection back then, and that I can sense that it was life and death back then if nobody came. But now when my boyfriend doesn't text back, it's hard, but it's not life and death now. Not to be dismissive, right? But to just differentiate here now from there then. Long answer to a really good question or set of questions.
Wow, makes so much sense. So well said. Thank you. And I love this next question as well. Oh, it keeps scooching up on me. From Claudia. Do you have any experience in working with autistic or other neurodivergent clients? Is there anything one should do different or be aware of when working with autistic clients?
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into polyvagal theory, but what we're bringing as one of our core skill sets as psychotherapists is our relational capacity. And because so much of what we're healing with CPTSD is nonverbal, very often we're relying on things like eye contact and voice tone and proximity, how close and how far away we're sitting. When we're working with someone who's neurodiverse or autistic, those very nonverbals can sometimes feel really threatening. And so part of what we're trying to do is help someone know that they actually get to be at choice now about how much contact or lack of contact. How much eye contact do they want from me, and how close do they want me to be or further away? So that when we bring in some of those basic kind of, we call it proximity tools as somatic therapists, but when we give clients choice about whether or not they want to make eye contact or want us to make eye contact, like I can say, it's, I'm going to just experiment for a moment with averting my gaze and notice what happens in you as I look away. And sometimes my client will go, oh my gosh, I can finally relax. Great, that's an option for us at any time, right? Or we might experiment with just check in with how close or far away our chairs are. As somatic therapists, we're trained to have chairs that can move closer or further away. If you're working online, you can experiment with being closer to or further away from the camera. And again, it can just be this like, oh wow, when you're there, I actually can feel myself, right? And then another piece that can sometimes come up here is just like, what does it mean to feel one's body? And it's not for me to kind of put valence or right wrong on whether or not one is feeling your body, feeling the entirety of your body, or just your fingertips or the tip of your nose, or orienting your attention out the window to that beautiful, red-leafed tree out there. That's what's out my window. Um, right. So we can give clients lots of choice about where to place your attention. And I think one of the core wounds around autism and neurodiversity is that we had too much attentional kind of fixed expectations about making eye contact, about how much individuals were processing. So often, the individuals I've worked with have said, it's not that I don't feel, Arielle, it's that I feel everything so much of the time. And so actually to feel like I have choice, and I'm talking more on the high functioning autism scale because we're speaking so verbally, we can, have a whole different conversation about more nonverbal clients, but nonetheless, right? Like to know that I have choice about whether or not I'm making eye contact is so valuable because when I make eye contact, it's like a complete download of what somebody else is feeling. I feel everything, right? And so it goes back into some of that high emotional tracking and sensitivity. And so it's just a lot about honoring boundaries at its core. All right, let's take one more question, and then I know we're due for a break.
Okay, this is from Mallory. I have several clients with the diagnosis of complex PTSD, and they often exhibit symptoms of OCD. I'm wondering if you can speak to this, if it seems relevant. My speculation has been that the parts who exhibit symptoms of compulsion and obsessive thoughts are attempting to gain that sense of control you spoke to earlier.
I think that is very, very true. So yes, I do think again it wasn't on that list of the other, potential diagnoses that we or kind of other symptoms, but by all means, obsessive thinking and compulsion behaviors in relationship to maintaining a sense of control can be variants on this. To some degree, I'm not going to worry too much if we're looking through that transdiagnostic lens. I still think we're going to get efficacy with whatever the presentation is. That said, when I am working with someone who has very high level OCD compulsions, and not just the O type, but the compulsion, the behavioral type, I think that shifting over to other forms of treatments for OCD can be a really, really beneficial kind of co-layer to the treatment. So whether that's exposure response prevention or there's another one that I'm spacing on the name of. It starts with the I. It has another acronym. But basically, if we're going to kind of help bring in some very direct ways to kind of disrupt that immediacy of the patterning of jumping into the compulsive behavior and to work with what I think is at the root of all of this, building more distress tolerance, that's going to be helpful for your borderline presentation. It'll be helpful for OCD. It'll be helpful for substance abuse that can be comorbid as well. Can I be with the discomfort without jumping ship on myself into one of those behaviors? And that takes time. That takes time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for those answers.
Thank you. Thanks for helping with the questions. Again, I know there's more than 100 questions out there, so I appreciate you being able to extract some of them. I'll see you all.